thing I want to talk about is exactly what do we mean when we say the working class. So in his piece, Anton Jaeger writes of an utterly disorganised working class. But who even are they? Are they left-wing? And how do we organise them? Jaeger continues, the destruction of collective institutions in the 1980s, signalled by Thatcher's crushing of the union movement and François Mitterrand's gutting of the French Communist Party, but also visible in the rapidly ageing membership of conservative parties, made possible new spectral forms of collectivity. Among them was the rise of a particularly brash ethno-nationalism, fueled by the feedback loops of an anarchic internet and a savvy alt-right that developed there. Jaeger's making the very good point that one of the trails of the left has come from the undermining of traditional collective institutions such as trade unions, the French Communist Party, you might even say the traditional Democratic Party in the US, various associational groups and voluntary societies and so on, and traditional working class neighbourhoods, etc. And yeah, sure, one of the effects of this has been felt on the right with the emergence of the alt-right, but surely, and this is something Jaeger ignores, we could say the exact same about left-wing identity politics, right? Now, of course, sure, someone's identity is very often very tangible, very real. It has all sorts of effects on their life chances, not least their chances not to be murdered, in the street, but also on things like access to housing, access to education, access to jobs, etc. Right? So the fact that somebody is black or gay or transgender or a woman is, of course, not just some ephemeral issue that has no bearing on their lives. Of course, these things are massively important, but at the same time, all too often, this sort of identity politics can work to help the right, or certainly can work to help undermine collectivity and community, and therefore undermine the left, right? So it can lead to what I call the Kardashian-Jenner brand of socialism, which is when it's all about you as an individual. It's all about what a complex and nuanced and interesting character you are, right? That you are, a Muslim, but you nonetheless fuck like a champion, for example, right? It's all about self-empowerment and being your best self and all of this crap, sort of inspirational quotes type crap about you as a complex and interesting individual. And I think in particular, this is a problem for people who aren't in these particular groups, who can use identity politics to latch on to the sufferings of particular groups and the disadvantage of particular groups to try to associate themselves with this. So in the UK, for example, back in the 70s and 80s, you had groups like the Southall Black Sisters, which, as the name perhaps suggests, was a sort of feminist collective of black and Asian women in Southall in West London, or the Rock Against Racism campaign / the Anti-Nazi League, which was set up in the 70s in the UK, using music as a way to fight against racism and fascism. But instead, this has been displaced by what you might call, Black Twitter, right? Or, Black Ally Twitter. So instead of people actually joining groups to make real change, instead now their radicalism or their association with one kind of identity is signalled by putting certain words in their bio on Twitter or putting a certain image in their bio, right? And the problem with this sort of thing is that it does absolutely nothing. It carries no sort of risk or jeopardy. And whilst in some cases it might lead to real change. So, for example, if you look at Black Lives Matter in the US, which has clearly been organised and mobilised through Twitter, and that is obviously an example of something tangibly happening. But then look at Black Lives Matter in the UK, which is very different, right? In fact, it's dominated by white people. There was a really sort of terrifyingly embarrassing incident a few years ago where an airport in central London was shut down by Black Lives Matter protesters, and every single one of them was white. So this issue then can allow people to almost sort of appropriate the grievances and suffering of other people simply by claiming association with them or claiming support for their cause. And yeah, it does nothing. It's about individualism. It's about showing what a multifaceted character they are. It's not real allyship, and it's completely compatible with neoliberalism. Jaeger also claims that in addition to blue-collar workers, the primary skeptics of the economic settlement of modern America were the other group of left populist voters, young professionals. Highly educated, networked and web savvy, most of them graduated straight from the university and into the tight labour market of the 2010s. Many of them ended up in service jobs. Combined with a new internet-enabled public sphere freed of its old media shackles, most of them were up for radicalisation. And I think, whilst I largely agree with a lot of what he says there, apart from the most of them were up for radicalisation thesis, as I've said earlier, it's so easy to overstate the radicalisation of young people. And just because you don't have many opportunities, or you don't have the opportunities you think you should have, just because you are disadvantaged in terms of housing opportunities, say, this absolutely does not necessarily mean that you will become politically radical, as you know, the history of the past more than 100 years has shown. And this actually, I think, whilst I largely agree with what Jaeger is saying, was one of the real problems of Corbynism in the UK. That whilst ostensibly, theoretically, Corbynism was about challenging austerity, challenging neoliberalism, rolling back conservative imposed cuts to public expenditure, trying to create more socio-economic equality in the UK. Whilst it was definitely, its message, if you like, was focused at poor working class people, it was also focused at people of colour. It was also very much focused on international politics in the Middle East and elsewhere. But actually, the sort of people who were the most outspoken supporters of Corbyn, and definitely the sort of people who flocked to join the Labour Party after Corbyn's victory, were absolutely not poor working class people, people of colour, etc. They were overwhelmingly, young, white, downwardly mobile millennials. And, having a postgraduate degree and not getting the sort of job that you think you should get or had been, led to believe that you would get is absolutely a reason to be angry. But you're not in the same position as, a former industrial worker who's been laid off for 30 years, who's seen their entire community destroyed. And I think it's a problem if you take the Joe Kennedy approach, which basically says that, these two people are equal. That actually to be a sort of hipster in your late 20s, early 30s with a postgraduate degree in English literature and you have to work in a service job is pretty much the same actually as being a former steel worker from Concert or from Cleveland who's, had their entire livelihood and community and life destroyed and have absolutely no hope of the future. These two people are not equal, and it's really important that we don't treat them as such. And also then it creates a difficulty where one group of people it believes that they are speaking for and acting for another group of people, but actually they are completely different demographically from those people. So I think this is a problem that so much of the base of Corbyn in the UK and Sanders in the US was made up of young, white, well-educated millennials. But actually, they're not really fighting mostly for young, white, well-educated millennials. They're fighting for other people. And that's great, and that we should be proud of that. But when you are seeking to fight for and represent and speak for people who are not like you, very often it's very easy to completely misjudge these people and misunderstand what they want and what's the best way to reach out to them. So Sam Moss talks about as long as a relatively large majority of the American working class maintain the living conditions to which they are accustomed and have the leisure to follow their pursuits, they are generally well content and grateful to the system that makes these things possible. The radical who opposes this system and thereby jeopardizes their position within it is far more dangerous to them than the bosses who pay them. As long as the system satisfies their basic needs in the more accustomed manner, they are well satisfied with it, and whatever evils they behold in society, they attribute to unfair bosses, bad administrators, or other individuals. Now, fortunately, I actually think that a lot has changed in this respect since the 1930s. I now think that a lot of people are more willing to understand that there are systemic and structural factors making them have a crap life. And it's not just down to a few bad apples or a bad boss. The question is, what the hell are we going to do about it? How do we go from that understanding to actually mobilizing people to act and vote in certain ways? So the next quote from Sam Moss is when he says, "Besides the realities of bread and butter, which capitalism can still offer a majority of the workers, the radicals can submit only hopes and ideas, and the workers abandon their struggles the moment the demands are met." Now this, I think, has not changed, right? Parties of the right, be it Trump in the USA or someone like Boris Johnson in the UK, are very effective at offering very specific, concrete things to their voters. So Trump's like, build a wall, bring jobs back to the USA, slap tariffs on China, protect the Second Amendment, etc. Deport illegal immigrants, all the rest of it. Repeal and replace Obamacare. Okay, albeit that one was a bit vague because he had no idea what he'd be replacing it with, but still, quite simple, concrete messages. Likewise in the UK, in the last election, it was all about get Brexit done. Get Brexit done, get Brexit done, again and again. But also, there'd be dozens of new hospitals built, there'd be loads of new police officers hired, etc. But very small, not particularly ambitious, very concrete proposals to working class voters, and it did very well for both Trump and for Boris Johnson. So Moss continued by saying the revolutionists, however, are, so to speak, deviations from the working class. They are the byproducts of capitalism. They represent isolated cases of workers who, because of the unique circumstances in their individual lives, have diverged from the usual course of development in that, though born of wage slaves, they have acquired an intellectual interest that has availed itself of the existing educational opportunities. And yeah, this I'd like to say has changed actually, right? Nowadays, okay, sure, very often these revolutionaries are not of the working class, right? Even, by one generation, but still, these education opportunities, which were the preserve of very few back in the 1930s, are increasingly available to so many people, whether through traditional formal education or just through the internet and social media. It is now much, 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 much easier to educate, to agitate, to organise than it was in the 1930s, simply because of the power of media and education and the broadening access to higher education in particular. So that is perhaps some reason to be hopeful for the future. But as I was saying earlier, and as we're going to come on to now, it's really important for those of us who have benefited from an education, who do have this quite broad political awareness and political consciousness, to appreciate that we are very unusual, and especially the sort of people who we think that we are acting to help very often don't share these same convictions. So, for example, Sean McElwee, in his interview with Politico, says, "I'm a college-educated 18 to 34-year-old urban professional, so I'm a tiny percentage of the electorate. I'd be pretty surprised if what appealed to me appealed to the modal American voter." And whilst that might seem like a pretty obvious thing to say, I think that all too often so many of us on the left refuse to make that acknowledgement. If we are as nearly all of us are, college-educated 18 to 34-year-old urban professionals, how many of us aren't that realistically? And that's fine by itself. But the problem is then when we refuse to acknowledge that what appeals to us does not appeal to the modal American or British voter. And it's even worse when some people not only refuse to acknowledge this, but work to actively deny it, and to say it's somehow indicative of class hatred, to say that what appeals to young, well-educated urban professionals does not necessarily to appeal to different kinds of groups in the UK or the US. So McElwee continues by saying, it turns out that non-college whites are pretty conservative, whilst the much derided suburban wine mums are much more supportive of a progressive agenda. Again, this really shouldn't be too surprising to anyone, but we need to really fight on this. We need to make it to be absolutely clear that the sort of people whose votes we want to win over are not necessarily the most likely people to be supportive of a progressive agenda. We need to acknowledge this and tailor our approach to these people accordingly.